Is the light good? It's bad. We could crack this a little bit. You think that might help? If we crack this a little bit, it might help. All right. Okay. All right. Until you're ready to talk. They're keeping it on until you're ready to talk. All right, so we ready? One more person coming? Okay. Good morning, members of the media. Thank you very much for coming to the Tobago Council of the People's National Movement press briefing. We are sincerely grateful that you are here to be with us this morning. Let me just take this opportunity to introduce my team members with us. On my left would be Mr. Joel Jack, former Secretary of Finance in the Tobago House of Assembly. On my immediate right, our newly appointed Minority Leader, Mr. Kelvin Morris, and Ms. Petal Benoit, Minority Councillor. This morning, we just want to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to the people of Tobago for placing confidence in Mr. Kelvin Morris. As a young individual, we in the People's National Movement are extremely confident that he can rise to the challenge, and along with the young professional, Mrs. Petal Benoit, they will do an extremely laudable job in the Tobago House of Assembly. We are pleased that we have a voice in the Tobago House of Assembly to ensure that individuals in Tobago have the opportunity to be able to transcend their views through the People's National Movement. And we just want to express our gratitude to the people of Tobago for that. We also want to take the opportunity to congratulate the newly appointed Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly, the Honorable Farley Augustine, and his new executive. The people of Tobago have spoken, they've made a choice, and we in the People's National Movement have respected that choice, continue to respect that choice, and we express our sincere congratulations to the newly appointed Executive Council of the Tobago House of Assembly. We also want to express our thanks to our 11,000 plus supporters who gave us that show of support last 2 Mondays ago on the election day. And we are extremely grateful and thankful that 11,000 plus Tobagonians are in support of the People's National Movement. And we want to ensure those supporters that in the persons of Mr. Kelvin Morris and Petal Daniel, they will definitely be there in the House, ensuring that their views are placed squarely on the table. The Tobago Council of the People's National Movement will definitely have its council meeting before the end of this year to do our election post-mortem. We sincerely feel that it is critical that we have this meeting before the end of the year, and as such, the executive met last Monday and decided that we will have that Tobago Council meeting before the end of this year. And while I'm on that note, I am sure that you all are aware in the media and at large that our chairman, Mr. Calendar, has submitted his resignation. We want to take this opportunity in the PNM to express our love and gratitude for Mr. Calendar. We also want to indicate that Mr. Calendar has served the People's National Movement for largely more than 3 decades, and his service has been impeccable. It has been one of distinction, it has been one of class, and we are extremely proud that we had an individual such as Mr. Stanford Calendar serving in the People's National Movement, as I said before, way in excess of 3 decades. His service spans the development of the People's National Movement as a founding member and also serving as a member of Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We are indebted to Mr. Calendar for his yeoman service to the party, and I would suspect that Mr. Calendar felt that the time had come for him to submit his resignation, and we respect that, and we wish him well and his family well in the future, and we thank Mr. Calendar immensely for his service to the People's National Movement. In addition to that, I want to take this opportunity as well to inform the members of the public that this is the Christmas season. We are still in a pandemic, and we want you to bear in mind that while we may not be in office, we still have a responsibility to all Tobagonians as a political movement on the island to encourage everyone, to plead with everyone on the island to follow the protocols, the health protocols. Wash your hands, wear your mask, and social distance. It's the Christmas season. We know the beaches have been opened for a short period of time in the morning, but we encourage you not to go out there to lime, to drink alcohol, and to just do what is right in the face of this pandemic. We've been seeing the numbers escalating, and we want our brothers and sisters in Tobago to remain safe. So I take this opportunity to wish you, the members of the media, a Merry Christmas and a prosperous New Year. God's richest blessings to you and your family. And to the Tobago public at large, our People's National Movement supporters, we wish you a Merry Christmas and God's richest blessings for the ensuing New Year. I want to take this opportunity now to hand you over to the Minority Leader, Mr. Kelvin Morris. Mr. Morris.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And let me say a pleasant good morning to all of Tobago, Trinidad and Tobago, members of the media. It is indeed a pleasure to address you as the minority leader of the Tobago House of Assembly. And I would really want to start off by thanking all of Tobago, Trinidad and Tobago for your best wishes, for your prayers, for your advice thus far. It is really, really appreciated. I also want to extend in this season compliments of the season and best wishes to all of Trinidad and Tobago, and wishing us a safe and a bright and prosperous new year. The first matter I would like to address has to do with our concern over the increase in COVID-19 infections and deaths in Tobago. The Office of the Minority is indeed concerned over the rise in COVID-19 cases and increase in deaths over the last week especially. I think just yesterday recognized that it's over 5 persons would have died and succumbed to this dreaded virus. We in the PNM, we would have always articulated a position that the vaccine saves lives. And we continue to reiterate that position and continue to encourage all our citizens of both Tobago and Trinidad to get vaccinated. We also want to speak directly to the the government and the administration of the Tobago House of Assembly, the Secretary of Health in particular. We want to encourage her to work in partnership with the central government and not work at variance. This COVID-19 phenomenon is not to be made a political football. It is not one to be politicized. And we are asking and we are encouraging the administration to work with our colleagues, work in cohesion, and work in collaboration with the People's National Movement central government to ensure that the lives of all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago is secured during this period. You see, it cannot be a Dr. Rowley thing. It cannot be a fight. It cannot be... Dr. Rowley did not bring this COVID-19 virus to Trinidad and Tobago. This virus is a worldwide phenomenon. We are seeing developed nations struggling to cope with this virus. And we here in Tobago must work together. We must work collaboratively. And I am calling on the PDP administration to set a clear mandate, a clear position on vaccination. Because it cannot be the Secretary of Health is saying to all of Tobago, let's get vaccinated. But the Deputy Chief Secretary is on the other hand telling people, do not get vaccinated. All hands are needed on this deck at this point in time. Our situation is dire, and it requires us all to work together. On the side of the minority and the PNM, rest assured, we are ready, willing, and able to give all support that is required to ensure that we really get a handle on this increase in infections and deaths. Secondly, I would warn you would recall very early, as soon as I was sworn in, I would have indicated my concern and my discomfort with the situation where we had a Deputy Chief Secretary sworn in while holding the position of President of the PSC. And while I would have committed to writing to the Chief Secretary, Honorable Fali Augustine at the time, very early after that, we saw the Attorney General penning a letter, actually 2 letters, to the Honorable Chief Secretary. However, to date, the information is that the Honorable Chief Secretary would not have responded. So I would have held on my letter because we were both writing about almost the same thing. Consequently, eminent speakers and eminent personalities, such as our former Chief Secretary, Mr. Hochoy Charles, would have agreed that that position taken by the current administration is ultra-virus to the Constitution, which clearly states Section 16, Clause 8 of the THA Act states that a secretary or the presiding officer shall not engage in any trade, business, occupation, or other undertaking for profit or remuneration other than that of serving as a secretary or the presiding officer. Simply put, one should not have no other work but that of a secretary. Therefore, I look forward to the court's interpretation and clarity on this matter. Like Mr. Charles, I would also want to strongly encourage my good friend, Mr. Farley Augustine, to take a page out from Mr. London's book and let humility lead the way. He does not have to like the AG personally. However, we ought to give the office of the Attorney General the respect it deserves. The final point I want to make and really bring the media up to date is in terms of my relationship with the Chief Secretary. I will be writing to the Chief Secretary shortly to request a meeting with him. And in that meeting, I would be proposing that we seek to establish a quarterly arrangement where we meet and discuss the business of Tobago's development and Tobago's administration. From very early, I would have indicated that this minority, this PNM-led minority, will work in the best interests of Tobago. So we will work collaboratively to ensure what is good for Tobago continues, and what is not in the best interest of Tobago, we will ensure that the administration is called to account. Additionally, we are in the process of setting up the Office of the Minority, and in setting up the Office of the Minority, we are now looking at staffing. We will be having our bi-monthly press briefing. We are also looking at ensuring that we engage the wider Tobago population. So very early in the next year, we would set out on a series of consultation with various stakeholders throughout Tobago so that we can build consensus and really get a clear understanding of what are the issues amongst the various sectors and how we can best articulate that to ensure that Tobago, the business of Tobago development, moves forward. Rest assured, as is evident in our positioning and in our articulation, we will do what is best for Tobago at all times. And on that note, I hand over to my colleague, Minority Councillor, Mrs. Petal Daniel Benoit.
Good morning to members of the media, to our viewing and listening audiences, colleagues at the head table. Today, I will come just before the former Secretary of Finance in sharing some insights in terms of our budget processes used by the Tobago House of Assembly in relation to receiving funds from the Ministry of Finance to manage the affairs of the Assembly. You may recall in October of this year, the Honourable Minister of Finance would have delivered his budget presentation in Parliament for fiscal 2022, October 1, 2021 to 30th September 2022. After the budget debate, Parliament would have approved the sum of 2.339 billion for the running of the activities of the Tobago House of Assembly. So in other words, the parliamentary allocation for fiscal 2022 was 2.39 billion. Disaggregated 2.075 billion for recurrent expenditure. And when we speak of recurrent expenditure, We speak of those expenditure used to run the day-to-day operations of the Assembly, such as salaries and wages, office stationery, utilities, rates, repairs and maintenance, and the like. And the development program allocation was 264.135 million. The Tobago House of Assembly would have requested releases from the Ministry of Finance. And of course, after the completion of the internal processes, the THA would have received funds from the Ministry of Finance via checks, which are generally or normally deposited into the bank accounts of the THA. And let's drill down a bit further. So the THA would receive funds in October 2021, and these funds will be released or were released to divisions to manage the expenditure and the operations of the Assembly. So they will be used to pay salaries and wages, to pay utilities, pay rent, etc. Similarly, in November, that would have been done. So we would have drawn down on the parliamentary allocation, and those funds received from the Ministry of Finance would have been released to divisions or issued to divisions and used for their day-to-day operations. We are now in the month of December 2021, and as we are aware, in December, we would normally pay salaries and wages of public officers early in the month of December before Christmas. So then the funds received in December would be used to pay salaries and wages and other operating costs. Further, it was indicated that for the first quarter of fiscal 2022, that is October, November, and December, the Tobago House of Assembly would have received some $558.750 million to fund its activities. Based on our parliamentary allocation of $2.339 billion, it therefore means that the Tobago House of Assembly, the balance on its allocation to be received is $1.78 billion. And this, the Tobago House of Assembly will draw down on in the coming months, January to September 30th, to fund the activities of the Assembly, in keeping with the fifth schedule of the Tobago House of Assembly. So, the Tobago House of Assembly still has a balance on allocation that will be drawn down on to fund its activities, and that is in the sum of $1.78 billion. And before I hand over to the former Secretary of Finance, who will give greater details, I too want to thank everyone for their well wishes. First, thank the Minority Leader for the opportunity to serve in this capacity. I also want to thank the People's National Movement and thank the people of Tobago for all their well wishes, their prayers, and all that they would have been sending to us during this time. We thank God for the opportunity at this time, and we ask for your continued prayers as we move into this new season. At this time, I also want to wish everyone a blessed Christmas, a bright and prosperous New Year in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, and we also want to urge everyone to please observe the COVID-19 protocols and be safe. So best wishes to each and every one and your families.
Good morning to members of the media, let me acknowledge the Vice Chairman of the party, the minority leader, and the minority councillor. A special good morning to members of the media and those persons who are joining us live. Just picking up from where Mrs. Benoit would have left off in the context of treating and debunking the notion that the Assembly does not have any money. And I think she would have laid out the basis in terms of how we draw down funding on a monthly basis from the Ministry of Finance as it relates to the overall funding. As Secretary of Finance on the 8th of December, while preparing to the mid-office, I penned a letter to the incoming Secretary of Finance because at the time we were not told officially who would be the Secretary of Finance. And in that letter, I also prepared a dossier or collection of documents to assist the incoming Secretary of Finance with the transition. And the intent at the time was to make the process as smooth as possible. I have not received any acknowledgement of the letter, and I note the Chief Secretary and the issues in terms of receiving correspondence. But the intent was to provide a smooth handover process and to facilitate a smooth transition and to minimize any impact on the work of the division and to facilitate minor and to minimize the disruption to divisions across the Assembly, as well to minimize the impact on the Tobago economy. Included in the dossier that was left for the Chief Secretary was a draft estimates of revenue and expenditure for fiscal 2022, the Recurrent and Development Program monthly expenditure reports for October 2021, the 2021 Tobago House of Assembly's financial statements, the 2021 Tobago House of Assembly's, or 2022 Tobago House of Assembly's budget statement, the Tobago Medium Term Planning Policy Framework, the updated Tobago Socioeconomic Digest, recent work programs of departments within the Division of Finance and Economy, and as well the Tobago Intelligent Island Report. I also updated on some ongoing work within the division, and as well to indicate to the incoming Secretary of Finance the number of state enterprises under the purview of the Division of Finance and Economy, and to indicate that strategic plans and financial statements for these companies that they were available. I indicated as well to the incoming Secretary of Finance that the work of the Secretary of Finance is indeed an arduous one, and that the campaign was over and that it was time to serve the people of Tobago. And in that context, when I heard the statement that about the money crisis and the lack of funding within the Tobago House of Assembly, I was concerned, because as Mrs. Benoit indicated in terms of the funding, when I was as Secretary, the funding prior to the receipt of funds from the Ministry of Finance for December totaled over $314 million. So that was an area of concern as well. Additionally, when the figure for the unspent balance and the contingency fund was also outlined, I think as well additional clarity should have been brought to the fore, because that figure that was quoted, that was a rolling balance from the previous financial year, and the process in terms of completion of the bank reconciliations and the submission from the various departments was not in train as yet, and the unspent balance for fiscal 2021 should be in the vicinity upwards of closer to 75, 85 at least minimum, on a conservative estimate, $85 million. But in the context of the statement by the Secretary of Finance, he also indicated that he took a very cursory glance of the documents, and that should at least temper some caution, because in terms of making pronouncements when you have just had a very cursory glance of the documents, that I would urge caution, because when we talk in the Tobago context, we are not just speaking to Tobago and the nation. We are speaking to the rating agencies, international investors, multilateral agencies, and it may send the wrong signal when truth and in fact a crisis does not exist. And I understand, and I made the point in the letter, and that is the reason why I left the dossier in terms of ensuring that the incoming Secretary of Finance was appraised of the latest expenditure report, and I would have hoped that at the time he would have been handed in, or he would have been in receipt of the cash balances of the Assembly, and to really make an informed decision. And again, to reiterate, unspent, what forms the unspent balance? We have the balances, the unreleased balance from our allocation. We have the balances under recurrent and development program in the previous financial year for each division, and any accrued interest. All of these would be transferred into the contingencies fund at the beginning of the year. The reason for the delay in the completion of the exercise is that we were waiting the submission from divisions, and for divisions to complete their bank reconciliation, all their bank reconciliations, and to submit the necessary statements to us at the Division of Finance and the Economy. So in a nutshell, I think in terms of the funding to the Tobago House of Assembly, persons might recall the process that we have utilized in treating with and mobilizing funding and financing to the Assembly. You may recall that I have stated before that as it relates to recurrent expenditure for the Assembly, we usually receive upwards of 70% of our requests from central government, while under the development program, the shortfall is severe, and perennially we receive approximately between 15 to 20% of our requests. So this year I asked for $1.5 billion under the development program. However, I received $264 million. And that places in context the challenge that we have in terms of funding our public sector investment program. And that is why our alternative financing mechanism modality is so important to us in the Tobago context. And I would just like to put that on the table, and during the Q&A session, I'll clear up any additional questions that you may have as well. Another question that was raised would have been the rate of expenditure in the Assembly. And just to put that in context as well, in fiscal 2021, we would have expended close to $400 million under the development program. And in the context of recurrent expenditure, we'd have expended approximately $1.7 billion. Our average annual month rate of expenditure on the recurrent is $146 million. So that really places the Assembly body corporate in a particular context, and also outlines our patterns of expenditure. So in that, I would just end at this time. And again, let me take the time to congratulate the Minority Leader on his appointment to office, and also the Minority Council. I know they will do a sterling job. Let me also take this time opportunity to congratulate the residents of Backlet, Mount St. George, for their support over the past 8 years, and also the residents of Bagatelle Backlet for their support during the past elections that were held recently on December the 6th. And of course, season's greetings to all of the reporters present and to everyone who is currently live joining us during this press briefing. Let me hand it over to the chairman as we invite questions from
Thank you very much, Mr. Jack. At this point, we would invite the media, any questions that you may have.
Any explanation as to the absence of the political leader this morning?
Say that again, please.
absence of the political leader.
Explanation as to the absence of the political leader this morning?
No, there's no particular explanation with regards to that. Thank you for your question, Liz. No, there's no particular response in regards to the absence of the political leader this morning. We are going to have our council meeting carded for the end of this year, and political leader would be definitely present at that meeting.
But when you bring up from the report this morning, is it a question that the Tobago PNM Council is stating that the finance secretary side that has been is live, is telling lies with respect to Tobago's finances? Or is it that you are saying he cannot calculate?
Well, what we would do, and I trust that you would appreciate our approach this morning, because we have individuals here who would treat with the Tobago Council's business, we have individuals who would treat with the Assembly Legislature business, and we have individuals who would treat with the response to finance of the Tobago House of Assembly. So I would allow former Secretary of Finance to respond to that.
No, I was making the point that the Secretary of Finance did indicate that he took a cursory glance of the documents. And while that may be so, I think we have a responsibility to place on record the facts as well. And as outgoing secretary at the time, I took the time to put together the report and to assist in facilitating the transition. Because when I came in office in 2013, I understood at the time the challenges of the job. And having been through the rigor of that 2013 financial year, I thought it best that I provided the.
Mr. Jeff, are you saying the secretary spoke too soon?
Well, I wouldn't want to preempt the secretary, but he did indicate that he was probably waiting until January before, in terms of highlighting the finances, and he also indicated that he was in the process of preparing a budget. No, well, I'm concerned about the statement for Tobago, not Joel Jack per se, because what I have done on a regular basis was to report to the people of Tobago, both in the annual June budget statement and also during the reallocation motion. You may recall the last reallocation motion was in November 2021, and that was a follow-up to the budget presentation in June. And during that time, in sections 3 of my annual budget statement, we would take time quite in detail to outline in terms of all the funds, the allocation, the revenue coming to the Tobago House of Assembly, and how we allocated and we disbursed those funds, and how those funds were spent over the past year. Additionally, in November of 2021, I was looking at a draft, and I don't have the Hansard before me, but we also indicated the deployment of the finances, all the funding coming to the Assembly and the alternative financing, and how we propose to treat with the shortfall, because at the time when we totaled all the projects that we had to execute, I think the figure at the time was $932 or so million, and we proposed a mechanism. And what is interesting and insightful was that the current Secretary of Finance was the person who responded, not traditionally the minority leader. So the information is there, the Hansard records are there, and fortunately I have a copy of the last Executive Council minute as it relates to the reallocation of the resources of the Assembly.
We just recognize Mr. Leacock.
Yes, it is.
Well, I would like to ask my voice just the question I was in part of that.
Ask you, answer you.
Could we allow him to respond, and then we would follow through with your
If it's related, come.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I want to know, in the dossier that you left,
Mm-hmm.
will you have indicated how the bond financing was spent?
All right, so let me answer the question by Mr. Leacock. And I want to quote from this document before you, Executive Council minute November 11th of 2020. And you ask for the authority. This is the authority. And the Executive Council would have agreed, and let me just read the document, because in essence what we are saying that the Executive Council is informed that the delays in obtaining funding from the bond transaction has constrained the pace and rollout of a number of projects listed in Table 2. The Executive Council is reminded of two projects, the Thompson River Bridge and the Moriah Health Centers, were completed in fiscal 2020 utilizing the Assembly's internal resources, while the Smithfield Connector Road was accorded lower priority ranking, and the Pigeon Point Heritage Park Coastal Restoration Project is catered for under the Development Bank of Latin America CAF funding. Therefore, the provisions of the bond, provisions in the bond for these projects can be utilized in fiscal 2021 to finance new or ongoing projects. So it is listed, so this is the authority, and it was also included in the reallocation motion in the House. When I checked my draft, as I said, I don't have the Hansard. So it was approved as part of the financing mobilizing method by the Assembly for fiscal 2021. And what this minute and the motion that was debated in the House, what it did was to outline a comprehensive suite of projects. Now, if I go to table, the appendix, if I look in the appendices, this is Appendix A. We have a suite of projects listed here in it. So this is the authority, Mr. Leaker. All right, agreed? It's an executive council minute. It's an executive council minute. So it's an executive council minute. Well, it's an executive council minute. So in terms of the authority, we had the authority. The authority was approved by the executive council, and the date here is November the 11th, 2020, executive council minute 429 of November the 11th, 2020. And again, I'm reminding persons of the motion that was debated in the House, in the legislature, approving this strategy for us to mobilize funding in terms of the overall management, the fiscal, November the 11th, 2020, and 429. So the last debate in the House, not the last, I think December would have, no, the House may have been prorogued before. But the sitting in November, that is where we will debate following the allocation of funds to the Tobago House of Assembly. We would debate the strategy of managing the resources of the Assembly in each fiscal year. That process started in 2013 when I assumed office as Secretary of Finance, and I outlined in detail the process. The processes at the time was to restrict recurrent expenditure, transfer the savings, to treat with the shortfall, to deal with Assembly priority programs and projects, utilize the bond financing, PPP modalities, obtain funding and technical assistance from multilateral agencies, and also to utilize the $108 or so TT million that we were getting from CAF.
Well, Mr. Daphne, I understand me correctly, right? So the bond financing was for projects like the Tobago Road and so on. But because you did not get that money as yet, you used the capital expenditure. So
We use our internal resources. So when we got the money, in essence, what we did is to replenish our internal resources and to cover those expenses for important Assembly-approved program and projects.
Okay, so what was spent? What did the bond now get used?
All right. So if we step back a bit, we have an approval for a bond totaling $300 million. The bond was divided in two tranches, one 164 and the other 435 and some odd dollars. So that second tranche is what we will receive, and we're still awaiting the final approval from the Minister of Finance, and those funds.
What was the first tranche used for? What did you spend?
But infrastructure projects, a number of infrastructure projects. So let me read again what we had initially estimated: the bond to cover Thompson River Bridge construction, Smithfield Road connector, health centers, the Signal Hill River Bridge, the indoor sporting facility, Pigeon Point Heritage and Coastal Park restoration, among others. So you can recall from the statement that I read from the Executive Council minute, we got funding from CAF to deal with the Pigeon Point Heritage Coastal restoration, and that would have encompassed that project and some other projects dealing with coastal infrastructure. And again, the rationale was given as to why the funds were repurposed. All right?
Don't worry, that's all Mr. Audit in some of the various departments of the PHA?
No, not at all. I haven't forgotten you, Mr. Leaker. Yeah, the other, right. So I know I'm not, and again, if you reference section 3 of my annual budget statement, we would talk about how the Assembly, how we have started the phases towards modernizing the Assembly's accounting infrastructure, and how we started the process towards ensuring that we rolled out in advance the procurement legislation ahead of time, and to ensure that we adopted a policy of transparency, accountability, and value for money. So we welcome it, and you may recall as well that during my tenure we adopted the International Public Sector Accounting Standards, and again, all with a view in mind towards improving transparency, accountability, and ensure that we have value for money in all our transactions. All right? Right. Right, yeah, so Mr. Leacock, right, so we dealt with the bond, we gave you the authority, the Executive Council note and the motion that was debated and passed in the House in November. In terms of the balances with respect to the contingencies account and the unspent balances, I would have indicated prior as well that the process for the figure that was quoted, that was a rollover balance from the previous financial year. And if my memory serves me right, because it was in the first quarter, we would have dispersed funds from the contingencies account to treat with CPEP and URP. So that balance of 300 is a rollover balance. How we come up with the balance in the contingencies account, that is the unspent balance in the previous financial year, which will be fiscal 2021, the unreleased balance from our parliamentary allocation, as well as the residual balances in all the various accounts from divisions. And once the bank rec exercises are completed within the divisions, they will send a notification to the division. A warrant will be prepared, and the Secretary of Finance will make the necessary transfers from those accounts into the contingencies account by way of warrant. You also spoke about the fund balance. I'm not sure if the Secretary at the time referenced it, but Mrs. Benoit did indicate that if the statement by the Secretary of Finance is correct, that the fund balance, the amount that we received from the Ministry of Finance would have been around $538 million, Mrs. Benoit, also? 500 and? Right, 38 or so. And in terms of the bank balances, I don't have the printout of what was the bank balance on Friday, but based on the statement from the Chief Secretary, we could use those figures to disaggregate the balance available to the Assembly in this fiscal year and the funding availability. Right, and right, okay, good. Right, so in terms of when we did the initial assessment, that figure is very, very low, and a conservative estimate would be, I would say, $85 million. And he was also making the point that in terms of covering expenses for URP, that he was concerned. But if you our funding for URP in the previous years, that those funds are more than adequate to take care of the funding for the Assembly. And I want to make a point that Mrs. Benoit indicated earlier, to indicate that the Assembly received over $223 million additional in funding year on year. So from where I sit now and where I sat previously as at the 8th or the 9th of December, at 8th or 9th of December, we were not in a crisis. And again, I would caution that we temper our statements with respect to, these issues.
Carissa, hold on, Carissa.
The finance secretary report to the allocations that is received from the central government. Noted done irregularly and sometimes on a monthly basis. During your time there, was that really the situation, and did you always concern with central government about the situations that were happening?
Thank you for your question, Carissa. Have I completed your question, George? Okay. Right, good. Now, we are currently receiving releases from the Ministry of Finance on a monthly basis. This situation started under Mr. Larry Hawaii. And when Mr. Hawaii, and I raised the issue with Mr. Hawaii then, and he gave a commitment to look into it. However, right after Mr. Hawaii demitted office, you may recall that the oil and gas prices took a precipitous fall, and additionally, and invariably, the revenues of Trinidad and Tobago. You may recall as well that the budget at the time was $65 billion, and the administration was tasked with reducing the budget from $65 billion down to $55 billion because of the significant loss in revenues. And given the cash flow situation of the country at the time, after having our initial meeting with the minister, he indicated that this cash flow challenge, given the cash flow challenge, he was unable to give us our quarterly releases en bloc. And we had to play our part in assisting in this economic turnaround. And since then, fiscal 2016 thereafter, we have had successive periods of economic decline. I raised the issue again recently with the minister when we were, just prior to the pandemic in fiscal 2020, when we were hopeful that with the first quarter indicators that that the economy was turning around, but then came COVID, and again had its impact on the national economy and the Tobago economy. So the issue has been raised, was raised by me and the former Minister of Finance, Mr. Hawaii, and I have raised the issue with my colleague. However, given what is happening nationally and the state of the national finances, a commitment was given by the Minister of Finance to rectify this issue in the shortest possible time, once the cash flow improves.
Wait, hold on. Liz, you had a question? Okay, Clayton.
Right. Just keeping the theme, the new Secretary of Finance also said that the emergency fund is 200,000, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, that is the contingencies fund, and as I indicated, that was a rollover figure from the last fiscal. And you remember the contingencies fund, he equated it to the HSF. But remember, the HSF is a stock of funds that we invest over time to generate a returns, whereas the contingencies account is utilized during the year, and how we come up with it at the end is the ending balance from the contingencies fund and all the unspent funds on release from various divisions, unutilized, that will be withdrawn from the divisions and transferred into the contingencies account. It's similar to the fund nationally. At the end of the year, when ministries don't utilize their funds, all those funds are transferred into the consolidated fund. So the consolidated fund is a better comparator that we could use as an example, and according to the Tobago House of Assembly Act, we would utilize the contingencies fund for unseen expenditure and to treat with shortfall in allocation to the Tobago House of Assembly in any given year.
The new Secretary of Finance also said the monetary disbursement of the fund, and that helps for planning within the year. How is your comment on that?
And as Secretary of Finance, when I came in 2013, when I assumed office, our overdraft facility was $150 million. It currently stands at $250 million, and the Tobago House of Assembly is a body corporate, and corporate bodies of that size in terms of ensuring that they have, prudent management, will have a facility to treat with the timing difference of when you receive funds and when you disperse funds. And we have the facility in place, and that overdraft facility has ensured that we don't have any disruption in the operations of the assembly. That is what modern large institutions, that's what you do in order to manage fairly well, while we ensure that we work out the cash flow issues on the national side, and we continue lobbying with the Minister of Finance. And an issue was raised about the cost. What you also have to look at as well, in the context of utilization of the overdraft facility, is the fact that we also earn interest on our account. So that over $2 billion flowing into the Assembly's coffers over time will earn us some interest. So that is part of the expense of doing business until we have the issue.
Was there any point in time over the past 6 years of a PNM central government that the disbursements came on a quarterly basis? Or was it that every month over the past 6 years has been?
Well, since best before, I think it was 2014 or 2015, the monthly releases to the Assembly, we have been receiving monthly releases to the Tobago House of Assembly from the Ministry of Finance.
So there was no attempt at all over the past 6 years?
Yes, we have attempted to have the issue resolved. There might have been 1 or 2 instances when we got it in 2-month tranches, but in terms of receiving it quarterly en bloc and in advance, no.
Mr. Jack, I'm just trying to tie you into a statement concerning whether or not you're comfortable with the body financial.
If you want?
I'm just trying to tie you into a statement, whether or not you're
No, but let's start with the process, and remember that the bond transaction started. We indicated this in several budget statements. In 2017, we came again as part of the budget and the reallocation and indicated that we're closer to the completion. You may recall as well that I've stated that the challenges in completing the process since 2013, some of the challenges that we encountered, it was administrative, we had legislative issues as well, and some of those projects were shovel ready and were earmarked to be financed, and we had to utilize internal resources then. So the process, we had the approval from Executive Council, we debated in the House, and everything was open and above board. So in terms of the overall mobilization of the Assembly's finances, this is not unusual in a national sense. Nationally, the government will borrow, they will go on the open market for budgetary support to finance their capital expenditure program and a suite of other projects. So in that context, I'm fairly comfortable. We have the authority, we have the Executive Council note, and the process was debated in the House.
So just give us an idea of what it's costing the Assembly to get money on a monthly basis to overdraft facility. Are we looking at millions of dollars? Because the Chief Secretary said that in allocation to Tobago, the cost of doing transactions on a monthly basis overdraft facility is not including the overdraft. Can you give us a figure of what it costs to teach you to operate like that?
Mrs. Benoit, any idea? I think annually, but it's not. Yeah, I'm not sure if annually it will cost us $5 million, or I don't have the figures yet, but I can surely check and get back that figure and send it to you. But what I indicated, you have an organization receiving over $2 billion in funds, and as you undertake your prudent financial planning. This is all part of it. Financial controllers and persons who are charged in large organizations with arranging the finances. This is how they would use their overdraft, other financing options to ensure that the cash flow to the organization is not interrupted and that the work of the organization continues unabated so that they can achieve their targets.
Mr. Liko.
I just wanted to ask, right, from where you sit over the last 8 years, the Prime Minister is saying that Tobago generates $200 million on an annual basis. They always say hindsight.
2020.
What do you think the Tobago House of Assembly, what projects could the Tobago House of Assembly could have implemented so that Tobago could have contributed more to itself and possibly some to the national coffers?
Well,
we've heard about agricultural projects. We've heard about STEM. We've heard about so many other projects. And people, when we spoke to people on the street, people taken by surprise that, Tobago is only generating that amount of money on an annual basis.
Well, let me say the $250 or $200 million that the Prime Minister reported was the revenue figure stated that we collected, but it does not reflect the economic activity nor the revenues generated within Tobago. And as part of the act as well, we have been, and I have stated it in my previous budget statement, that some of the data is not recorded and is not disaggregated. We spoke about all the firms, the banks, the insurance companies doing business in Tobago, but remitting their taxes in Trinidad. We also spoke about some of the customs duties where we buy cars in Trinidad, but we buy cars in Tobago, but the duties are paid and remitted. And so those are some of the issues. So the figure is underreported. But as well, in terms of facilitating private sector expansion, that is what we have attempted to do in terms of providing the enabling environment and the financial support through BDU, through venture capital, through the establishment of COVs, other private sector entities to generate economic activity. And so for us to generate revenue, that is why as well the Sandals project was so important. And the conservative estimate suggested approximately $40 or so million annually in tax revenue coming to Tobago. So it is in that context we have to view those figures. One, in terms of the underreporting. Second, in terms of the work in the Assembly, in facilitating economic diversification. And thirdly, as well, the need for us to attract foreign direct investment, such as Sandals et al. And if you recall as well, those programs would have been stymied and cancelled by members, the leader of the PDP, who took full responsibility for that. So,
Mr. Liko.
Well, I'll just read a part of the letter that I left with the incoming secretary and then hand the mic to the chairman to answer the question. And I stated, as Secretary of Finance and the Economy, you are entrusted with the responsibility to provide an enabling environment for Tobago to thrive and succeed, irrespective of political affiliation, as well as to manage and mobilize financial resources for Tobago. I'm therefore hopeful that the information provided will assist you in executing your duties. Because, and I made the point that the campaign is over, this is time for persons to buckle down and work. The blame laying will only go so far. Persons after they are sworn into office, and in terms of finance, there was no crisis, but here there was a claim of a crisis. And we are well aware as well in terms of the financial support that was provided to the Division of Health during the pandemic. What was not stated as well would have been the $12 million or so that we expended to ensure that we acquire new equipment for the health services during fiscal 2021. And that has to also be placed on record and in context. So with that said, I would urge persons that they have been elected to office to serve, and this is time for them to buckle down and get to work. Chair?
Thank you very much, former Secretary of Finance, Mr. Jack. Mr. Leacock, thank you for your question. However, I would like to indicate that I'm quite certain that we all can acknowledge that the former Secretary of Health is not here, and that question will be properly directed to her. I suspect that you will have that opportunity to answer that question before the end of the year at a post-council meeting before the end of this year. So I'm certain you can hold fast to that question reserved for the former Secretary of Health. Clayton, this would be the last question. Yeah. What I want individuals to appreciate is that at this point in time, we in the People's National Movement respect anyone's decision to resign from the executive for whatever particular reason. But at the same time, we have an organization that is 65 years old. And we as executive members of that organization, of this organization, the People's National Movement, have a responsibility to stand in defense of a challenge. And we've come to a place where we've had a defeat in the elections, but at the same time, we still have a responsibility to the people of Tobago, some 11,000 plus who would have given us their support at the elections, at the polls, and therefore, as an organization and as a reputable one that is, we ought to appreciate that in office we serve and out of office we serve. We have more than 11 members of the executive still serving and sitting, and we have more than a quota. So we are definitely managing. Thank you for your question. Thank you very much, members of the media, for coming to our press conference this afternoon, and we sincerely appreciate it. Blessed Christmas to each and every one of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.